So this past weekend, the UFC's 2021 schedule got underway with a huge fight between Max Holloway and Calvin Kattar. And we already have a Performance of the Year contender. Now, I would say that let's be very specific about that. This is a Performance of the Year contender, not a Fight of the Year contender. Because Max Holloway, did he ever just go in there and just blow that guy away for 5 rounds? Calvin Kattar, I mean, he got his share of licks in the fight. But he didn't really have very many what you would call moments in that fight. He was dominated from bell to bell. Max Holloway, he fought that fight like he was a man with something to prove. And in fact, he did have something to prove. Max Holloway had something to prove in the sense that he is the true and legitimate featherweight champion of the world. Now, that's not to say that he has the belt, because as a matter of fact, as everybody knows, Max Holloway, he doesn't have the World Featherweight Championship belt. Right now, that's in the hands of Alexander Volkanovski. But nobody who watched that Holloway-Volkanovski fight, aside from perhaps the judges, could actually have looked at that fight and think that Volkanovski won it. I mean, he lost no fewer than 3 of the rounds. And in MMA, in a 5-round fight, if you lose 3 rounds, pretty much you have to come back and you have to dominate the remaining 2 to just be able to eke out a 1-point lead. It is possible. If you come out and you drill out a couple of 10-8 rounds over your opponent, you can lose the previous 3 but still win the fight overall, but that is absolutely not what happened in Holloway-Volkanovski 2. As a matter of fact, my personal argument is that I thought that Holloway had all 5 rounds. He certainly had no fewer than 4 rounds. So in a 5-round fight, if your opponent wins 4 rounds, there is absolutely no way that you can win that aside from, you could come back in the 5th round, you can get a knockout or a submission, but again, another thing that didn't happen. Max Holloway won that fight. Max Holloway is the legitimate world champion in the featherweight division. Volkanovski is basically, he's a fraudulent champion. And aside from being a fraudulent champion, the other thing that Alexander Volkanovski is apparently he is delusional. Because he's already come out and said that after his fight against Brian Ortega, he wants his next fight after that to be a quote-unquote super fight with Connor McGregor. Which, for one thing, fat chance. For one thing, it's going to be very difficult to get onto Connor McGregor's dance card after this upcoming weekend, almost no matter what happens. And there actually are a number of very interesting scenarios that are currently available. But Alexander Volkanovski, he just isn't one of them. And to even come out and pretend that a Volkanovski versus McGregor card would be a super fight is kind of an astonishing idea. To think that Volkanovski, anything that Volkanovski could be considered a super fight is in itself just astonishingly delusional. Because really, for a fight to be a super fight, what you really need is, in this situation, you need 2 fighters, preferably 2 champions, who have both been so dominant in their division that they've beaten everybody. They've cleaned out their divisions. And so McGregor, he has done that previously in the past. He certainly hasn't done that with the lightweight division right now. But there have been times where he's looked around and not seen very many opponents to fight. But Volkanovski, he's only had 2 fights against a top 5 fighter in the featherweight division. And one of those is a fight in which, realistically, he should have lost that World Featherweight Championship to Max Holloway. So how does Alexander Volkanovski think that he even belongs in any kind of a super fight talk at all? It's absurd. Really, it's not guaranteed that he's even going to still be the champion after he fights Brian Ortega. There's a very real possibility that Brian Ortega goes into that fight, takes it off Volkanovski, and then he's the person who goes on to defend that featherweight championship of the world against Max Holloway. So Volkanovski, not only is he not in a super fight conversation because he just hasn't established that kind of dominance in his weight division, but really his last fight has him looking like a beatable champion. And the reason why people look to these super fight situations at all is because a champion looks unbeatable in their division. That the only way to actually beat that guy is to actually pit him against the champion from another division. That was the reason why there was so much talk about GSP versus Anderson Silva. That was the reason why there is now so much talk about GSP versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. It's why there's so much talk about John Jones versus Stipe. It's why there's so much talk about John Jones versus Israel Adesanya. And that's why they're moving Adesanya up to light heavyweight to challenge Blachowicz. Because right now, at least on Adesanya's side of it, they're looking around at middleweight and they're not seeing very many contenders there to actually face Adesanya. Volkanovski has a lot of work to put in before he's anywhere near being any kind of like a real, legitimate super fight scenario. As a matter of fact, Max Holloway is likely to get to a super fight scenario long before Volkanovski ever does.